Hi guys. So today we will learn about the intrinsic muscles of the thoracic wall. So a thoracic wall is an essay question which includes intrinsic muscles, intercostal muscles, intercostal nerves, etc. So we'll do this question in parts. So today we'll learn about the intrinsic muscles of the thorax. So when we come from superficial to deep, the intrinsic, if this is a superficial and this is deep structure. Coming from superficial to deep, the intrinsic muscles of the thorax is divided into three, which includes the external intercostal muscle, the internal intercostal muscle, and the transversus thoracic muscle. So superficially we have external intercostal muscle, and on the intermediate layer is formed by the internal intercostal muscle, and the deep layer is formed by the transversus thoracic muscle. So coming to the first muscle, that is external intercostal muscle. So this is the external intercostal muscle. So this external intercostal muscle, it extends from the tubercle of the thoracic vertebrae. It extends from the tubercle of the thoracic vertebrae posteriorly to the and to the costochondral junction. Costochondral junction where the rib and cartilages meet. And thereafter the external intercostal muscle continues as the anterior intercostal membrane. It continues as anterior intercostal membrane. Now coming to its origin and insertion. Origin, it arises from the lower border of the rib above and is inserted into the outer lip of the upper border of the rib below. From the lower border of the rib above to the outer lip of the upper border of the rib below. And now coming to the direction of the fibers are directed downward, forward and medially. They are directed downward, forward and medially. Now talking about the nerve supply, it is supplied by the nerve of that corresponding intercostal space, and action, it will help in the elevation of the rib during inspiration. Elevation of rib during inspiration. Now about the second intrinsic muscle is the internal intercostal muscle. So this internal intercostal muscle, it extends from the lateral border of the sternum to the ankle of the rib, where it continues backward as the posterior intercostal membrane. So it arises from the lateral border of the sternum and it continues till the ankle of the rib and then continues as the posterior intercostal membrane. Now coming to the origin, it arises from the floor of the costal groove. It arises from the floor of the costal groove and is inserted into the inner surface of the outer border of the corresponding lower rib. Now about the direction of the fibers. The fibers are directed downward, backward and laterally. They are directed downward, backward. This is the internal intercostal muscle. So they are directed downward, backward and medially. Laterally. They are directed downward, backward and laterally. Now coming to the nerve supply, they are supplied like the external intercostal muscle. They are supplied by the nerve of that corresponding intercostal space. And about the action, they also act as elevators of the rib but during expiration. So the difference between external and internal intercostal muscle is that external intercostal muscle will help in the elevation during inspiration, while the internal intercostal muscle, will also called as the intermediate layer muscle, it will help in the elevation of the ribs during expiration. Now coming to the third group of intrinsic muscle, it is transversus thoracic muscle. So it is classified into, or it is divided into three muscles, that is the subcostalis muscle, intercostalis intimae muscle and sternocostalis muscle. So first we'll talk about the intercostalis intimae muscle. So the intercostalis intimus muscle, it occupies the middle 2/4 and middle 2/4 of the intercostal space, and then its origin, it originates from the inner surface of the rib above to the inner surface and is inserted into the inner surface of the rib below. Suppose consider this to be our rib. So this is the outer lip and this will be the inner lip, and a rib has an upper border and a lower border, except this is a typical rib. So typical rib has an outer lip and an inner lip, and it has an outer border and an inner border. This is the outer border and this is the inner border. So its origin is from the inner lip. So this is the inner lip of the two ribs. So this originates from the inner lip of the upper rib above to the inner lip of the rib below. To the corresponding rib below is the origin and insertion of the intercostalis intimus muscle. Now about the direction of fibers, it is just like that of the intercostalis intimus muscle, that is downward, backward and laterally. supplied by the intercostal nerve of that corresponding space, and it has the same action, that is it acts as an elevator of the rib during expiration process. So that's about the intercostalis intimus muscle. Now coming to the subcostalis intimus muscle. So subcostalis intimus muscle, it originates near the ankle of the rib and it arises from the inner surface of the rib above. Similarly here, that is from the inner surface of the rib. This is the inner lip of the rib. So it arises on the inner surface of the rib above, and then it is inserted into the inner surface of the second or the third rib below. Not like that is it is inserted into the inner lip of the second or the third rib below. Now the nerve supply, it is supplied by the intercostal nerves, and they act as a depressor of the rib. They act as a depressor of the ribs. Now coming to the last muscle is the sternocostalus muscle. So the sternocostalus muscle, it arises from the lower one-third of the body of the sternum, from the xiphoid process, and from the costal cartilages of the lower 3 or 4 ribs. So they arises on the lower one-third. So we know sternum is divided into manubrium, body, and the xiphoid process. So the sternocostalus muscle arises from the posterior surface of the sternum. So this is the posterior surface of the sternum, and it arises from the lower one-third of the body of the sternum, from the xiphoid process, and from the costal cartilages of the lower 3 or 4 ribs, and they are inserted into the posterior surface of the costal cartilage of the second to sixth rib. Second to sixth rib, they are inserted into the posterior surface of the costal cartilage of second to sixth rib, and they are supplied by the intercostal nerve, and their function is that it draws the costal cartilages in which it is inserted. So that's about the intrinsic muscles of the thoracic wall, and we need to know the position of the intercostal nerves and vessels. So we know the intrinsic muscles from superficial to deepest divided into external intercostal, internal intercostal, and transversus thoracis. So the intercostal nerves and vessels, they lie in between the intermediate layer and the deep layer. They lie in between the intermediate, that is in between the internal intercostal and transversus thoracis. We can see in this diagram. So this is the internal intercostal muscle, and this is the transverse thoracis muscle. So the intercostal nerves and vessels, here we have the nerves and vessels. So they lie in between the internal intercostal muscle and the transversus thoracis muscle. Thank you.